Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my channel, Fluent Pro Hub.
All right, so today we're going to dive right in to something I think a lot of you out there can probably relate to. You can understand English, right? You can read it, you can listen, maybe you can even like ace a grammar test.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to actually speaking fluently, it's like hitting a wall.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we really want to unpack that experience, figure out why that happens, and give you some really concrete, fun things you can do to actually bridge that gap and move from understanding to actually speaking with confidence.
Yeah, it's a really common thing that comes up. I mean, that difference between what we take in passively and then what we can actually produce ourselves.
Right.
So this is the puzzle that we can definitely get into.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that really jumped out at me from the stuff we were looking at for this was this personal story. Someone was talking about being in English class and like following everything the teacher was saying, totally getting it. But then a simple question comes their way and boom, mind blank. They knew the words, they knew the grammar, but they couldn't get it out. It's like this instant freeze. Is that something you've come across or experienced yourself?
That feeling of like, oh my gosh, like my brain just shut down at the worst possible moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's super familiar to a lot of people learning languages, and the stuff we've looked at really gets into like why that is. I mean, you've got things like the fear of judgment, right?
Right.
Which can be such a powerful inhibitor because when you're speaking, you're putting yourself out there in a really direct way. And then there's also this idea of like muscle memory for speaking.
Ah, okay.
That like coordination between your thoughts and breath and like physically forming the words.
Like it's a skill.
It's a skill, totally.
Yeah.
You've got to practice it like anything else. And then, of course, there can be like these deeper psychological barriers.
Right.
These kind of like almost like nagging doubts about your ability to really speak well.
Right. Yeah, those definitely can creep in. But I think what's so important from what we've looked at is this idea that making mistakes, hesitating, that's not like you failing. It's part of how you learn. And I love the analogy it used. It's like learning to ride a bike.
Oh, yeah.
You're going to wobble. You're probably going to fall off a few times. That doesn't mean you're never going to be able to ride a bike, right?
That's exactly.
And it really emphasized this need for consistent daily practice.
Yeah, that shift in perspective is really, really important. Like moving from thinking of mistakes as setbacks and more as like stepping stones or learning opportunities. And that idea of short, regular practice is so powerful because it starts to like chip away at that fear and build up that muscle memory that we were talking about. And one of the things that it suggested was just this really simple thing, speaking out loud for like 10 minutes every day.
Oh, wow.
About anything. Doesn't matter what it is. Yeah. What you had for breakfast, what you're going to do today, just to get into the flow.
Yeah. Just getting used to making the sound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think what's really cool about that is just that small, consistent habit can make speaking feel a little more natural and less intimidating.
Right. Less like this big scary thing.
Totally.
So, one of the techniques that came up again and again and sounded super effective was this thing called shadowing. Can you kind of unpack that for us?
Yeah. So shadowing is like a really cool, immersive technique. And you're basically listening to native English speakers. So this could be through like podcasts or movies or interviews, anything where people are like speaking naturally.
Right.
And you're trying to like mimic them in real time.
Wow.
So you're not just repeating the words, but you're also trying to like capture their intonation, that like rise and fall of their voice, the rhythm, the way they pronounce different sounds. So there's this one story in the material about someone who was doing this with their favorite TV show. And they would like spend a lot of time shadowing the dialogues, really trying to get those like subtleties right. And what they found was that over time, speaking started to feel less like this mental translation exercise,
right,
and more like an instinctive response.
Like it was just flowing out.
Yeah, totally.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I guess what makes shadowing so valuable is that it helps you internalize the natural flow of English.
Yeah, exactly. So you're not just like processing individual words, you're getting a feel for how they link together.
Right.
Like where those natural pauses are or the emphasis on certain syllables. It's almost like learning the choreography of the language.
Oh, I like that. The choreography of the language. Now, another thing that really came through was the importance of language exchange, just like interacting with other people in English. I mean, it seems kind of obvious, right? If you want to get better at speaking, you have to speak.
Yeah.
But the material really dug into why it's so powerful.
Well, yeah, I think it's easy to underestimate the power of that real human connection. And, the sources talked about this idea of like finding language exchange partners.
Mm-hmm.
So like native English speakers who are learning your native language.
Okay.
And this creates this space where you can both practice and learn in this kind of relaxed, supportive space. And what's interesting here is that the focus is really on shared learning and encouragement.
Right.
Rather than just constantly being corrected.
Right. Like you're both in the same boat.
Totally. And then there was that great story about joining a local conversational English club. Right?
Yeah.
And like that initial nervousness and the feeling of just listening more than speaking at first, but then gradually, finding the confidence to participate and then actually enjoying the conversations.
Yeah.
It just shows how much of a difference being in a supportive community can make.
Huge difference. And I think a lot of people probably underestimate that. But okay, so that sounds great.
Yeah.
But where do you actually find these opportunities? How do you find those people?
Right. So the material actually had some really good practical tips about this. Things like joining like local meetups or online language exchange groups.
Okay.
So there are platforms like Meetup or Tandem, or you can even connect with people in like Facebook groups dedicated to language learning.
Right. Right.
And I think we also shouldn't underestimate the power of technology.
Yeah.
Like there are some really cool language learning apps that have voice recognition now.
Okay.
And you can even have these like simulated conversations, which can be a really good way to get some low pressure practice.
Yeah. Especially if you don't have somebody like right there to practice with.
Right.
But the material also mentioned something that sounded a little bit weird to me at first, talking to yourself in English.
Ah, yeah.
So is this something people actually do?
It sounds a little strange,
Mm-hmm.
but engaging in self-talk in English can really work to build fluency and confidence because you're essentially like practicing forming sentences. You're like working through your thoughts in English, but without any of that pressure of having to actually speak to someone else. So it's kind of like having this like private rehearsal space for your speaking.
Right. Oh, okay. Okay, I like that. So it's like the warm up
Exactly.
before the real thing. Okay. Okay. So we've talked about like the importance of reframing how we see mistakes.
Yes.
But the material took that one step further and suggested keeping a journal just for your speaking mistakes.
Oh, I love this idea.
So what do? You just like write down every time you mess up?
Yeah, it's really about becoming aware of the kinds of mistakes you're making and then using that to get better. So by actually taking the time to note down the errors you make, you might start to notice some patterns. Like, are you always struggling with a particular verb tense? Or maybe you're getting tripped up by certain prepositions. Once you actually see those patterns, then you can practice in a more targeted way.
It's like turning your weaknesses into like a to-do list.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Now, another technique that sounded a little bit intimidating, at least at first, was this idea of recording yourself speaking and then listening back to it.
Oh, yes.
So is this, this sounds a little bit painful, right? Who actually likes listening to the sound of their own voice?
I think it can be kind of awkward at first, but honestly, it can be really helpful for just being objective about your own like self-assessment. So when you listen back, you can really focus on things like your pronunciation, your fluency. Are there a lot of long pauses?
Right.
And even your intonation. And one of the stories in the material, they talked about feeling initially awkward about it, but then being surprised when they started noticing improvements.
Oh, wow.
Which I think could be really encouraging.
Yeah. Okay. So, then the material shifted into some more creative approaches to speaking practice, like storytelling.
Yes.
So how does that actually work for like, getting better at speaking?
Well, storytelling is really powerful because it gives you this like natural context for using language.
It's engaging. So whether you're like writing a short story or retelling something that happened in your day or even just making up a story in your head, it gives you a chance to practice using different vocabulary and grammar in this like meaningful way. Right. And then, of course, reading those stories aloud, that adds another layer of speaking practice. Right. And, they even talked about the idea of like sharing those stories with language partners, which can be really cool. Yeah. Because it gives you a chance to get feedback, but it also makes it more like a conversation, more like a connection, Less like you're drilling something. Right. Right. Exactly. It's more fun that way. Okay. So then the material went on to share this really interesting experience. This person who went to an international conference and was really nervous about it, but then they actually participated in discussions.
Yeah, that's such a great example of just putting yourself out there in a real world situation.
Right.
And seeing Like, oh, okay, the practice actually pays off. And what's really important here is that confidence in speaking isn't something that just happens overnight. It's something that you build by putting yourself in those real-life speaking situations.
Yeah.
And every time you speak, even if it's just like a quick comment, it's a step towards building that confidence.
Yeah, it's all practice.
Yeah.
It all adds up. Okay, so how do you keep that momentum going?
One of the things they emphasized was just setting these achievable goals, like
Right.
small steps that you can actually accomplish, and then celebrating those successes, no matter how small they might seem.
Right.
Because it's really about acknowledging your progress and staying motivated on that journey.
Right. Okay, so another thing that I think a lot of people experience, and I know I definitely have, is this thing called language anxiety. It can be really crippling.
Oh, yeah. Language anxiety is so real. It can be a huge hurdle. And one of the things that they pointed out was that there's this connection between anxiety and stress,
Yeah.
like physical stress,
Yeah.
right? So you're actually getting stressed out. So incorporating things like mindfulness and relaxation techniques, things like deep breathing exercises, or even like doing a quick meditation before you're about to do some speaking practice, that can really help to calm your nerves.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's about preparing your mind and body.
Okay.
Okay, so another cool technique they talked about was this idea of role playing.
Okay, so what is that exactly? Does that like acting?
Yeah, it's kind of like acting, but it's really about simulating real life conversations,
Right.
but in this like safe space.
Okay.
So you can practice these everyday scenarios like ordering food or asking for directions or making small talk.
Right.
Even more complicated things like maybe you have a disagreement with somebody or you have to negotiate something, and it gives you a chance to try out different phrases, different approaches
Right.
without having to actually deal with the consequences in real life.
Right. Right. It's like a testing ground.
Exactly. Yeah. And the material talked about these people who would set up role-playing sessions with friends who were also learning English,
Oh, okay.
which sounds really fun and also like a really great way to learn and give each other feedback.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so of course we have to talk about technology, right?
Of course. Yeah.
The material talked about how all these new advancements with AI and machine learning are being used in language learning apps.
Yeah.
So you can actually get real-time feedback on your pronunciation.
Yeah. And even things like aspects of your fluency as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So these tools can be super valuable. I don't think they can ever fully replace like human interaction and feedback,
Right.
but they give you these like immediate insights into how you're pronouncing things. And it's a very like low pressure way to practice and get better.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay.
And beyond those, specific language learning apps, they also emphasize the importance of actively engaging with authentic content, like
Right.
movies and TV shows and YouTube channels and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, passively listening is helpful for comprehension, but if you really want to improve your speaking, you need to be more active, right? So they talked about things like repeating lines from movies, analyzing how the speaker's pronouncing things, even shadowing, which we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And all of that takes something that's passive and turns it into this active speaking opportunity.
Okay. Then there was this one idea that I thought was really intriguing. Learning by trying to teach someone else.
Ah, yes.
Even if it's just like a simple concept,
So it's funny because teaching is actually a super effective way to solidify your own understanding.
Really?
Yeah, and when you're in that position of having to explain something to someone else, it makes you process the information at this deeper level. You've got to really articulate it clearly.
Yeah, man.
And one of the things that they said was that it's also a really good way to overcome that fear of speaking in front of other people.
Right, right. Okay, so I think a really important point that the material made was that progress in language learning isn't always linear. There are going to be times when you feel stuck.
Totally.
Or maybe like you've even gone backwards, and that can be so discouraging.
Yeah, and that's totally normal. It's part of the process. And it's really important to remember that like persistence and consistent effort are the keys.
Yeah.
They're what really matter. So as they said, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
And those small regular steps, they really do add up over time.
Okay. So what's one way to kind of like help you stay persistent?
Well, one of the things that they suggested was this idea of keeping a language diary.
Okay.
So you can write down new words and phrases that you come across,
Yeah.
and that helps you like build your vocabulary.
Yeah.
But the really important thing is to actually try to use those words in your everyday speaking practice to really make them your own.
Right. It can't just stay on the page. You got to actually bring it into the real world. Okay. So finally, the material talked about immersion. And this is often seen as, like the most direct route to becoming fluent.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like?
So immersion is really about putting yourself in an environment where English is like the main language that's being spoken. So that could be through travel or going to events where people are speaking English, or even just creating an immersive environment at home. And what's great about it is that it forces you to actually use your language skills in real time. You have to communicate.
Yeah.
It can be challenging. But as that one story in the material said, it can also be incredibly transformative, and it can really speed up your learning.
So, okay, let's just quickly recap some of those key things that we talked about today, like reframing how you see mistakes.
Yeah.
Making practice a daily habit, even if it's just for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Using techniques like shadowing, recording yourself, actively looking for those opportunities to have conversations with other people, finding that supportive environment, really engaging with authentic English content out there in the world. And even thinking about teaching as a way to learn. There are so many different things that people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main message that comes through from the material is that this feeling of, I understand English, but I can't speak it.
Right.
It's totally something you could overcome.
Yeah.
With the right strategies and that consistent dedication, it really does make a difference.
So imagine a future where you can speak English confidently without that hesitation, without that freeze. You can just engage in conversations, express your thoughts, your ideas. That sounds amazing, doesn't it?
It does. It's such a good feeling. And it's definitely a reality that you can create. And the sources we looked at, they really stress that it all starts with taking these small, manageable steps.
Yeah.
Embracing those mistakes as learning opportunities, celebrating every bit of progress, and realizing that every single conversation is a chance to grow.
So here's a thought to leave you with. What's one small step you can take today to start bridging that gap between understanding and speaking? Maybe it's shadowing a short audio clip, maybe it's striking up a conversation with another learner, or maybe it's just recording yourself speaking for the first time. Whatever that small step is, it could be the beginning of something really amazing.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.